The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated hope and despair alike. It clung to the sweat on a man's brow, settled in the folds of a woman's dress, and gave the very air a taste of grit. At the edge of the market, where the respectable stalls gave way to the fringe, a young woman stood over a steaming pot. Her name was An Lee, and the light blue of her prairie dress was a defiant splash of sky against the endless brown of the town. A small hand-painted sign offered food from a far home, but most folks just called it the foreigner's cooking. They watched her, their eyes a mix of curiosity and suspicion, but few ever stopped. Today was different. A man was walking toward her stall, and his steps were so deliberate they silenced the market chatter around him. He was tall, his frame lean but hard, and the gun on his hip was not for show. It was a part of him, worn smooth by use and familiarity. Garrett. The name was a whisper that traveled from the saloon to the general store, a name that meant trouble best left alone. He stopped before her small wooden counter, his shadow falling over her pots. The scent of ginger, star anise, and simmering broth rose to meet him, an alien perfume in a world of dust and fried bacon. An Lee did not look up, her focus intent on the ladle in her hand. "Don't taste my food," she said. Her voice was low, not a plea but a command. It was a strange warning from someone trying to sell their wares, and it made the silence around them tighten. Garrett's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the neat arrangement of bowls, the meticulously chopped vegetables, the clean cloth she used to wipe the counter. He saw not just a meal, but an act of profound care in a careless world. He picked up a small porcelain spoon. The handful of onlookers held their breath. "I said don't," she repeated, finally looking at him. Her eyes were dark, and in their depths he saw not fear, but a weary exhaustion that bordered on defiance. It was the look of someone who had drawn a line in the sand so many times she was tired of the dust. He ignored her. He dipped the spoon into a bowl of shimmering, slow-braised pork and brought it to his lips. The town watched, waiting for the verdict. Would he spit it out? Laugh? Overturn the table? The moment stretched, thin and brittle. He closed his eyes. The flavor that bloomed on his tongue was not just food. It was a story, of a long journey, of a sun-drenched memory, of a sorrow so deep it had become savory. It was the taste of a place he had never been, yet somehow felt he knew. He swallowed. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her, past the foreign face and the simple dress. The gunslinger, the man who had faced down death in a dozen dusty streets, went utterly and profoundly quiet. He simply stood there, spoon in hand, while the world waited for a violence that never came. The reason she said those words, the reason her warning carried the weight of a locked door, began thousands of miles away and a lifetime ago. It started in a village where the air tasted of salt from the sea and the soil was generous. Her father was a scholar who had become a cook, a man who believed that memory was the most potent ingredient. He taught An Lee that a recipe was a map of the heart, a way to navigate back to those you had lost. To feed someone, he would say, his hands deftly folding a dumpling, is to share your spirit. Do not offer it to those who would crush it. They had come to this country not for gold, but for a promise, a whisper of a place where a man's work could build a future. But the promise was a lie, written in a language they couldn't read. The railroad work had broken her father's body, the relentless sun and the foreman's cruelty stealing the light from his eyes. He died in a canvas tent, with nothing to his name but a worn set of knives and the recipes he had carried in his head. An Lee was left with only his final words, a fevered whisper against the din of the work camp. "Do not let them erase us. Make them taste our memory." So she had come to Redemption Gulch, a town that seemed to live up to its name in name only. There was no redemption here, only judgment. She used the last of their money to buy a small space at the edge of the market, a spot no one else wanted. Every morning she rose before the sun, her small stove a flickering beacon in the pre-dawn gloom. The work was her ritual, her prayer. The rhythmic chop of the cleaver was a meditation. The slow simmer of a broth was a lesson in patience. She cooked not for them, but for him. For the memory of his hands, his voice, the taste of home. The first weeks were brutal. People would walk by, their faces pinched with distrust. They called her food slop, heathen food. One man had paid a nickel just for the satisfaction of spitting a mouthful onto the ground in front of her. After that, something inside her hardened. Her father's words took on a new meaning. Sharing her spirit was a sacred act, and their spirits were closed, their palates poisoned by prejudice. So she stopped trying. She cooked, and if they wanted to buy, they could, but she would not invite them in. She would not beg for their approval. "Don't taste my food" became her shield. It was a test. If you respected the boundary, you were not worthy. If you pushed past it, you were just another person trying to take something from her. It was a lonely, bitter creed, but it was all she had left. It was the armor around her father's memory, and she would let no one breach it without a fight. Garrett was a man made of quiet observations. He'd ridden into Redemption Gulch a month prior, not looking for work or trouble, but for a place so aggressively mundane that his past couldn't find him. He took a room above the saloon and spent his days watching the town's ugly, predictable rhythm. He saw the petty cruelties, the hierarchies of power displayed in the way Mayor Thorne tipped his hat to some and ignored others. He saw the sheriff, a man named Miller, who enforced the law only when it served the interests of the powerful. It was a town like any other, a festering wound masquerading as a community. And he saw her. From his window he watched An Lee set up her stall each morning. He saw the deliberate grace in her movements, the almost reverent way she handled her ingredients. He saw the townspeople pass her by, their scorn as plain as the dust on their boots. He saw her chin lift a little higher each time. She never flinched, never begged. She simply endured, her presence a silent act of defiance against the town's suffocating conformity. He knew what that felt like. His own life had been a long string of such acts, though his were louder, punctuated by gunfire and the metallic taste of fear. He had a reputation he hadn't asked for but had been forced to maintain, a shadow that followed him, whispering of men he'd put in the ground. He was tired of it. He was tired of the weight of the gun, the constant assessment of threats, the hollowness that came after the violence was done. What drew him to her stall was not hunger, not in the traditional sense. He was starved for something else, something authentic in this town of facades. He saw in her a strength he recognized because it mirrored his own, albeit in a quieter, more resilient form. She fought her battles with a ladle and a pot of simmering broth. He fought his with lead and powder. He wondered which was braver. When he decided to walk across that dusty street, it was a conscious act. He wanted to break the town's unspoken rule, to cross the invisible line they had all drawn around her. Her warning, "Don't taste my food," was unexpected. It wasn't the plea of a desperate merchant. It was a guard at a gate. He understood it instantly. She was protecting something precious. And in that moment, tasting her food became more than an idle curiosity. It became a need. He had to know what was worth guarding so fiercely in a place like this. The flavor, when it came, was the answer. It wasn't just pork and spices. It was the taste of honor. It was the flavor of a memory kept alive against all odds. It was the quiet, unyielding truth in a town built on lies, and it silenced him more completely than any threat ever could. The quiet gunslinger's daily pilgrimage to An Lee's stall did not go unnoticed. Garrett would arrive at noon, lay 3 coins on the counter, and eat a bowl of whatever she had made. He never spoke much. A nod was his greeting, another his thanks. But his presence was a thunderclap in the town's social landscape. The same men who had sneered at her now gave her a wide berth. The women who had whispered behind their hands now fell silent when he approached. His silence was a shield, more effective than any wall. But protection for one is a threat to another. Mayor Thorne owned half the town, including the saloon that sold lukewarm stew and greasy steaks to the miners and ranchers. An Lee's small operation was a pittance, but it was an uncontrolled variable, an affront to his total economic dominance. More than that, Garrett's endorsement gave her a legitimacy Thorne couldn't stand. He ran his town on fear and conformity, and she represented neither. The trouble started subtly. First, Sheriff Miller paid her a visit. He was a big man, his gut straining the buttons of his shirt, his face perpetually flushed. "There's a new market fee," he announced, not looking at her but at a point somewhere over her shoulder, "for sanitation services. Double what you were paying." An Lee simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and paid. The next week, it was a complaint. Mrs. Gable, who ran the bakery and was a close friend of the mayor's wife, claimed the strange smells from An Lee's cooking were turning her bread sour. It was a ridiculous accusation, but Miller dutifully wrote it down in his ledger, tutting about public nuisance. Then the whispers began in earnest. Rumors, ugly and insidious, slithered through the town. That her food was unclean, that it was made with stray cats. The lies were designed to isolate her completely, to turn the town's passive prejudice into active hostility. People who had been on the verge of curiosity now recoiled. Her already meager earnings dwindled to almost nothing. Through it all, Garrett remained. He would sit on a crate near her stall, eating his meal slowly, his gaze sweeping over the market. He was a silent sentinel, and his presence infuriated Thorne. The mayor couldn't intimidate a man like Garrett with whispers or inflated fees. The conflict was escalating, moving from the shadows into the open. It was no longer about food. It was about power. It was about who had the right to exist in Redemption Gulch, and on what terms. An Lee found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't asked for, her small cooking stall transformed into a battlefield for the soul of the town. One morning she arrived to find her world destroyed. The stove was overturned, its iron belly cracked and cold. The sacks of rice and spices had been slashed open, their precious contents spilled and trampled into the dirt, mixed with mud and what looked like horse manure. Her pots and bowls were bent and broken, scattered like forgotten toys. The small, hand-painted sign had been snapped in two. They had come in the night, cowards who wielded their hatred under the cover of darkness. An Lee stood frozen, the morning chill seeping into her bones. It wasn't just the financial loss, which was devastating. It was the violation. They had taken the one thing that was hers, the sanctuary she had built from memory and grief, and desecrated it. The careful order of her world had been smashed into chaos. For the first time since her father's death, a sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound of utter defeat. She sank to her knees amidst the ruin, her light blue dress immediately stained with the filth. The fight had gone out of her. They had won. What was the point of holding on to a memory if the world was determined to grind it into the dust? The town was waking up. People on their way to the market slowed, stared, and then hurried on, their faces averted. They were ashamed, or perhaps afraid, but none offered a hand. None offered a word of comfort. She was utterly alone. That's how Garrett found her, a small, desolate figure kneeling in the wreckage of her life. He stopped a few feet away, his face a hard mask, but his eyes took in every detail of the destruction. He saw the broken sign, the spoiled rice, and the tracks in the dirt. He knew whose work this was. He could have gone for his gun. He could have walked to the mayor's office or the sheriff's jail and ended this with the brutal finality he was known for. That was the old way. But looking at her, he understood it would solve nothing. It would only validate their belief that he, and by extension she, were forces of violence and chaos. Instead, he did something else. He walked past her, picked up one of the dented pots, and carried it over to the town pump. He began to wash it, his movements methodical and sure. He didn't speak. He didn't offer condolences. He simply began the work of putting things back together. An Lee watched him through her tears, her breath catching in her throat. The simple act of cleaning a pot was a greater comfort than any words could have been. It was an act of faith. It said, without speaking, "This is not the end. We will rebuild." Slowly she rose to her feet, wiped her face on her sleeve, and walked over to join him. She picked up a broken bowl, and together, in the silence of the rising sun, they began to salvage what they could from the ruins. The dynamic between them shifted. It was no longer just a man buying a meal. It was a partnership, forged in the quiet understanding of shared defiance. An Lee used what little money she had left to buy new supplies, though she had to travel to the next town over to get them, as the local mercantile owner suddenly claimed to be out of everything she needed. Garrett rode with her, not beside her, but 100 yards back, a watchful shadow. Back in Redemption Gulch, he changed his routine. He no longer just came for lunch. He was there when she set up in the morning, and there when she packed away at dusk. He would sit on his crate, cleaning his gun or sharpening a knife, never speaking to anyone, but his message was unmistakable. The stall was under his protection. This overt alliance drove Mayor Thorne to a new level of fury. His thugs couldn't touch her now without facing Garrett directly, a prospect none of them relished. Thorne, a man who prided himself on his cunning, knew that brute force would make Garrett a folk hero and a martyr. He needed a cleaner weapon, one that looked respectable. He needed the law. So he convened an emergency town council meeting. With a great show of civic concern, he proposed a new set of public health ordinances. They were elaborate and filled with bureaucratic language, citing the need for commercial-grade preparation surfaces, regulated temperature controls, and sourcing of all ingredients from town-approved vendors. The laws were, of course, impossible for a small street vendor to comply with. They were designed to give the veneer of progress while functioning as a targeted piece of legislative malice. The ordinance passed unanimously. The next day, Sheriff Miller, looking profoundly uncomfortable, served An Lee with an official notice. It gave her 24 hours to cease operations or face a fine of $100, a sum she could not hope to pay in a year. The document was a death sentence for her business, all wrapped in the neat, tidy language of the law. She held the paper in her hand, the crisp edges feeling sharper than any knife. They had found a way to beat her that a gun couldn't stop. They were going to erase her not with violence, but with a rule book. She looked at Garrett, her eyes dark with a weary resignation. "There is no fighting this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is a different kind of weapon." Garrett looked from the paper to her face. He saw the exhaustion there, the feeling of being checkmated by a game whose rules were rigged against her. "Every weapon has a weakness," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The weakness of paper is that it burns. The weakness of a lie is the truth." An Lee looked at the official notice in her hands, then at Garrett. His words, "the weakness of a lie is the truth," echoed in the space between them. For days she had felt like a cornered animal, but something in his quiet confidence sparked a flicker of the old fire within her. Her father had not raised her to surrender. He had taught her that dignity was the one possession no one could take unless you gave it away. She would not give it away. "They want me to disappear quietly," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not be quiet." A plan began to form. Not a plan of legal arguments or loopholes, but one rooted in who she was. She would face the town council, not to beg, but to testify. She would use their own stage to tell her own story. The next morning she did not set up her stall to sell. Instead, she began to cook with a singular purpose. She chose her ingredients with the care of an artist selecting her paints. She would make one dish, a simple, clear soup with hand-pulled noodles and a single perfect wonton floating in the center. It was the first dish her father had ever taught her to make, the meal he made for her when she was sick, the one he claimed could heal not just the body, but the spirit. It was the purest distillation of his memory. Garrett watched her, understanding that this was a different kind of preparation for battle. He didn't offer advice. He simply provided support. He fetched fresh water from the pump. He kept the fire in her small stove steady and hot. His presence was a silent affirmation of her courage. When people from the market walked by, their curiosity piqued by the fact that she wasn't selling, Garrett's cool, steady gaze was enough to keep them moving. The air around her small stall became a pocket of intense focus, a sacred space in the middle of the hostile town. As she worked, she felt a profound sense of calm settle over her. She was no longer cooking for survival or out of defiance. She was cooking as an act of remembrance. Each fold of the wonton wrapper was a prayer. The stretching of the noodle dough was a testament to the strength passed down to her. The clear, fragrant broth was the essence of her story, simmered down to its most honest form. By late afternoon, she had prepared a single, beautiful bowl. It was everything she had to say, everything she was, contained in a simple piece of porcelain. She looked at Garrett and nodded. She was ready. He stood up, his hand resting naturally on the worn leather of his gun belt, a gesture as unconscious as breathing. "Then let's go," he said. "Let's make them taste the truth." They walked together toward the town hall, An Lee carrying the bowl with both hands, as if it were an offering. The setting sun cast their long shadows before them, two solitary figures walking toward a confrontation that would determine everything. The town hall was packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and self-righteousness. Mayor Thorne stood at the front, his chest puffed out, enjoying his moment of triumph. He spoke of progress, of standards, of protecting the good people of Redemption Gulch from unknown elements. His words were a masterclass in polite bigotry, wrapping his prejudice in the flag of civic duty. He never mentioned An Lee by name, referring to her only as the unlicensed vendor or the source of the sanitation complaint. When he finished, he called for a final vote to make the ordinance permanent and authorize the sheriff to collect the fine. "Does anyone wish to speak on the matter?" he asked, the question purely rhetorical. A smug smile played on his lips. Then a voice, quiet but clear, cut through the murmuring crowd. "I do." An Lee walked to the front of the room, Garrett a step behind her like a shadow. A wave of shock rippled through the hall. She placed the bowl of soup on the table before the councilman. The fragrant steam rose, a stark contrast to the stale air of the room. She did not look at Thorne. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the baker, the blacksmith, the ranchers, the women who had whispered about her. "My name is An Lee," she began, her voice steady. My father was a cook. He believed that food was not just for the body, but for the memory. He taught me that every dish tells a story. This story, she said, gesturing to the bowl, is about his home. It is about his love for his daughter. It is the first thing he ever taught me, and the last thing I have of him. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. You speak of rules and sanitation. I speak of honor. You speak of what is clean. I speak of what is true. You say my food is strange. It is not strange. It is just a memory from a different place. Is this town so small that it has no room for a memory that is not its own? Then Garrett stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a threat. He simply spoke, and the room held its breath to listen. I've eaten in fancy restaurants in St. Louis, and I've eaten hardtack on the trail. I know what good food is, and I know what poison is, he said, his eyes locking onto Thorne's. Poison isn't in a bowl of soup. Poison is in the lies you tell yourselves to feel powerful. It's in the fear you use to control your neighbors. He looked at An Lee, then back at the council. His next words dropped into the stunned silence like stones into a deep well. This woman has more honor and decency than any of you. She has built a life with nothing but her own 2 hands and her father's memory. And you want to tear it down because you're afraid of a new flavor. He let that sink in. Then he delivered the final, shocking blow. To ensure she has the protection and standing she is owed in this town, I ask for her hand in marriage. The proposal hung in the air, an impossible, electrifying statement that shattered the room's tense equilibrium. It was not a declaration of love. It was a strategic masterstroke, a move on a chessboard the mayor hadn't even known they were playing. Marriage, in this time and place, was a fortress. As Garrett's wife, An Lee would gain legal and social standing that she, as a single foreign woman, could never possess on her own. An attack on her would become an attack on him, and no one in that room was foolish enough to want that. Thorne's face went from smug satisfaction to a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, not with force, but with a piece of societal bedrock he himself championed. He sputtered, searching for a response, but found none. The crowd was a sea of stunned faces. They had come for a public shaming, a simple administrative execution. They were now witnesses to something far more complex and profound. They saw a gunslinger, a man defined by violence, using the most civilized of institutions, marriage, as his weapon of choice. And they saw a quiet foreign cook who had, against all odds, won the loyalty of the most dangerous man in town. The councilmen looked at each other, then at Thorne, then at Garrett's unblinking stare. The ordinance, moments before a foregone conclusion, now seemed petty and irrelevant. The sheriff, Miller, slowly took the official notice from his pocket and with a deliberate motion tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was the only noise in the hall. It was the sound of Thorne's power crumbling. The spell was broken. An Lee had not looked at Garrett when he spoke. She had kept her eyes on the crowd, her posture unbent. She understood what he was doing. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of ultimate respect. He was offering her his name, his protection, the only thing of value he truly possessed, so that she could keep her own. She met his gaze now, and in a silent exchange, an agreement was made. A partnership was formalized. There would be time later to understand what it all meant. For now, it was enough. They turned and walked out of the town hall, leaving a storm of whispers and confusion in their wake. They didn't look back. They walked into the twilight, the sky bruised with purple and orange, the day's battle won not with a bang, but with a bowl of soup and an unbelievable question. The air outside tasted clean, free of the hall's suffocating judgment. It was the first breath of a new and uncertain life. Their life together began not in a church, but at her stall the next morning. It was a strange and quiet affair. He helped her set up, his movements economical and precise. She cooked, the familiar rituals grounding her in the new reality. The town watched them, of course, their stares now filled with a bewildered respect. The story of the town hall meeting had become instant legend. An Lee was no longer just the foreigner. She was the woman who had faced down the mayor and won the gunslinger. Her stall, once a symbol of her isolation, was now the heart of a quiet rebellion. People started to come. At first it was just the curious, the ones brave enough to defy the town's old social order. A miner, his face still smudged with coal dust, bought a bowl and ate it standing up, his eyes wide with surprise at the flavor. A few women, tired of Thorne's wife and her social tyranny, followed. Each transaction was a small victory, a quiet vote for a different kind of town. Garrett never said, "I told you so." He simply took his usual seat on the crate, a silent partner in her growing enterprise. Their evenings were spent in a small cabin he rented at the edge of town. They were two solitary people sharing a space, the silence between them filled not with awkwardness, but with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. He would clean his weapons while she meticulously planned the next day's menu. There was a tension there, a current of awareness of the man and woman they now were to each other in the eyes of the world, but it remained secondary to their shared purpose. Theirs was a partnership born of necessity and mutual admiration. Have you ever had to build a home with a stranger? Not a house of wood and nails, but a home of trust, a shelter built from the shared understanding of a common enemy. It is a fragile and complicated thing. Love might grow there, or it might not. But respect, once earned in the heat of a shared battle, is a foundation as solid as bedrock. An Lee had her dignity. Garrett had found a peace he hadn't known he was looking for. Redemption Gulch was still a hard place, and Mayor Thorne was a snake, not a wolf. His defeat had only made him more venomous, more patient. The future was not guaranteed. But as An Lee served another customer, placing a bowl of her father's memory into their hands, she knew she was no longer alone. She had found her place, not by conforming, but by forcing the world to make room for her. And she had learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the only way to protect your spirit is to be willing to share it, even with a world that may not deserve it. What is the flavor of your own memory, and who would you trust to taste it?